It was a rainy Saturday afternoon when Ella first laid eyes on him. The kind of day where the world outside felt
It's
a little
okay,
too big and
Max.
a
We'll
little too
take our
gray,
time.
as if everything had fallen into a slow, peaceful hush. Ella had grown used to the solitude of her life, the quiet hum of an empty house, her thoughts drifting between memories of the past and the reality of the present. The world, for her, had always been a little quieter than others. Her father had left when she was only a child, leaving her with a mother who often had more questions than answers. There was a distance between them, not just from physical space, but from an emotional disconnect that neither of them knew how to bridge. But that afternoon, as she wandered the aisles of the local animal shelter, she felt something stir inside her. It was her first day volunteering there, a decision made on a whim when she'd overheard a conversation at the coffee shop about needing help with the dogs. Ella didn't have any particular love for animals, but the idea of doing something different, of helping someone or something, seemed like the right choice. She had no idea that the decision would change her life forever. The shelter had the usual array of animals, cats and dogs in cages, some pacing back and forth, others curled up in corners, looking as though they had given up on hope long ago. She had expected the noise, the smells, the chaos. But one cage in particular caught her attention. In the back corner, there was a small puppy, a golden retriever, no older than a few months, who sat in complete silence. His fur was matted, his eyes too big for his tiny face, and his little body looked thin, almost fragile. His posture was stiff, as if he was unsure whether he could trust the world around him. Ella approached slowly, her heart already feeling heavy as she gazed into those sad, wide eyes. She knelt in front of the cage, unsure of how to proceed, but the moment her eyes met his, something inside her clicked. She reached out a tentative hand, and to her surprise, the puppy didn't flinch. Instead, he took a small step forward, sniffing her fingers with the curiosity only a young animal could possess. The shelter worker, a woman with kind eyes and tired hands, stepped up beside her. "That one's Max," she said quietly, almost as if speaking his name was a secret. "He's a bit skittish. Found him in a litter with his brothers and sisters, but he's the quiet one. Doesn't bark much. He's had a rough start." Ella's heart broke as she listened to the woman's words. Max, she looked at the puppy again, who was still staring at her, his large eyes full of uncertainty, but also a kind of longing that she couldn't quite place. There was a bond forming in that moment, fragile and unspoken, and Ella knew she couldn't leave without him. "I'll take him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The shelter worker raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Are you sure? He's going to need a lot of attention, a lot of love." "It won't be easy," Ella nodded without hesitation. She didn't know what it was about Max, but something deep inside her stirred. She had been lonely for far too long, drifting through life with no real anchor, no one to depend on, no one to love without condition. Maybe Max needed her just as much as she needed him. The first few days with Max were harder than Ella had imagined. He was timid, unsure of everything in his new world. The first night, he curled up next to her, his little body trembling as if he was still unsure that this wasn't another fleeting moment of safety. Ella stayed up late, watching him, her hand resting gently on his back. His fur was soft, but his bones were thin, and she could feel the fragility in him, like something waiting to break. Ella had grown up with a quiet sense of longing. She didn't have many friends. The few she had were always a bit distant, wrapped up in their own lives. And though her mother loved her in her own way, it was always an emotional distance that Ella couldn't quite cross. It wasn't that her mother didn't try, but rather that the two of them never quite knew how to connect on a deeper level. Her mother was too wrapped up in her own pain from losing her husband years ago to realize that Ella was beginning to experience a similar kind of loneliness. But Max, this small, trembling puppy, had an innocence to him that made her feel like she was seeing the world with new eyes. He needed her, completely, unconditionally. Ella spent the first week getting Max settled. She gave him a warm bed near the living room window where sunlight would filter in during the mornings. She bought him soft food and a chew toy that he initially ignored but later grew to cherish. And every night, after a long day, they'd both curl up on the couch, Ella reading a book while Max napped by her feet. In those moments, Ella's heart began to thaw. Max had become her companion, her best friend. He wasn't just a doggy. It was the comfort she had been searching for on the weekends. When the weather was good, they would walk together through the nearby park. Max would bound ahead, then stop, waiting for Ella to catch up. He'd bark in excitement at every new scent. And Ella, who had always been so quiet and reserved, found herself laughing. Max's energy, his unbridled joy for the simplest things, filled her with a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. He wasn't just a dog. He was her connection to the world, to life itself. By the time Ella had taken Max to the vet for his first checkup, he was beginning to grow stronger. His golden coat had started to shine, his legs no longer wobbled when he walked, and he had begun to bark with excitement whenever she came home from work. He was no longer the quiet, timid puppy that had curled up in her arms that first night. He was a dog, full of life, full of spirit, and she was no longer the lonely, reserved girl who wandered through the world without knowing how to belong. Max had given her something she never realized she needed, a reason to smile, to laugh, to love again. As she stood in the vet's office that day, holding Max close as he sniffed at the sterile surroundings, Ella knew that her life had changed. Forever, in just a few short weeks, Max had become her anchor, her home, her family. And in return, she promised herself she would never let him down, never let him feel alone again. Max had chosen her just as she had chosen him. Together they would face whatever the world had in store. From that moment on, Max was more than just a dog to Ella. He became the center of her world, her companion in the journey of life. And though neither of them knew it at the time, their bond would grow deeper with each passing day, an unspoken promise that neither time nor circumstance could ever break. By the time Ella turned 25, Max had become as much a part of her as her own heart. They were inseparable, and the world around them had changed in ways that neither could have predicted when she first brought him home from the shelter all those years ago. The early days of puppyhood were behind them, and in their place there was a deep, silent understanding between them, a bond forged through time, laughter, loss, and love. Ella had moved into a small apartment in the city just after college, a place that was hers, no more shared spaces or cramped rooms. She was carving out her own life, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was standing on solid ground. But even in this new chapter, Max was always there. He wasn't just a dog who followed her around, he was a part of her world. Her constant companion, the one who kept her grounded. She'd bring him with her when she visited friends or family. And though he was a little more subdued than the energetic puppy he once was, his love for her never waned. Max had become a symbol of stability, of loyalty. In a world that often seemed chaotic and uncertain, life had its ups and downs, of course. Ella had settled into a steady job at a small publishing house, her passion for literature still alive in the quiet corners of her soul. She worked long hours, helping to edit manuscripts and organize projects, her mind always active, constantly juggling deadlines and ideas. But no matter how busy or stressful her days got, there was always a moment when she would come home to the comforting presence of Max. Max had grown older, of course. His coat had started to show the first signs of age, the once lustrous golden fur beginning to lose its shine. The energy that used to pulse through him in wild bursts had slowed, replaced by a dignified stillness. He no longer chased squirrels in the park or raced after the neighborhood children with the same fervor. But there was still joy in his eyes, still a spark that made his tail wag when she entered the room. And that was enough. Ella had started to notice, though, that he wasn't quite the same. His legs weren't as strong as they used to be, and the once playful bounce in his step had given way to slower, more deliberate movements. It wasn't something she liked to dwell on, but every now and then, Max would struggle to get up from the floor or would pause halfway through a walk, panting heavily, looking up at her as if asking for permission to stop. At first, she convinced herself it was nothing, just old age catching up to him. But deep down she knew Max was aging. His body, once so full of vitality, was beginning to betray him. It was one Saturday afternoon when everything shifted. Ella had come home from work early, her mind worn from a long week of editing, proofreading, and handling the ever-growing demands of her job. She was looking forward to a quiet evening with Max, just the two of them, sitting on the couch with a cup of tea and maybe a good book. She smiled as she opened the door, expecting the familiar greeting, the excited barking, the rush of energy, as Max bounded toward her. But instead, there was only silence. Max was lying in his bed in the corner of the living room, his eyes half closed, his body still. He didn't move when she called his name, and her heart skipped a beat. "Max?" she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. She approached him cautiously, kneeling down beside him. His eyes flickered open, and he looked up at her, his gaze filled with something that Ella couldn't quite place, tiredness, perhaps, or sadness. His tail didn't wag like it usually did when she came home. He simply watched her, a quiet recognition in his eyes. "Hey, buddy, you okay?" Ella whispered, reaching out to gently stroke his fur. It felt thinner than before, and his body was colder than usual. Her fingers trembled slightly as she touched him. Feeling the faintest shiver pass through his frame. Max shifted slightly, but it was clear that it took effort. His movements were slow, labored. Ella's heart sank. She could see it now. Max wasn't just slowing down. He was struggling. She spent the next hour with him, sitting beside him, gently coaxing him to get up and walk around. He seemed reluctant, his movements stiff, his legs shaky as he rose to his feet. When they finally made it outside for a short walk, Max lagged behind, his once strong legs barely able to keep up. He paused every few feet, panting heavily, his body sagging with exhaustion. Ella didn't know what to do. She didn't want to admit it, didn't want to acknowledge the reality that was becoming so painfully clear. She tried to brush it off, to tell herself that Max just needed a little rest, but deep down she knew. The next day, she took him to the vet. The waiting room was cold, the walls lined with bright, sterile posters about pet care and vaccinations. Max sat beside her, his head resting against her knee, his eyes glazed as he stared out into the distance. He had always been so full of life, so full of energy, that seeing him like this, quiet, subdued, felt like a blow to the chest. When they finally saw the vet, she was kind but straightforward. Max's health was declining. His joints were stiffening and he had a heart murmur, something that could be expected for a dog his age, but it meant his energy levels were no longer what they used to be. The vet recommended a few treatments to manage his pain and help with mobility, but there was no way to stop the inevitable. Ella sat in stunned silence as the vet explained everything. The world seemed to slow around her, the words she was hearing growing distant and muffled. She had always known this day would come, but she hadn't been prepared for it to be so soon. Max was still so young at heart, still so full of love. It felt impossible that she would have to let him go. The vet handed her a prescription for some medications, along with suggestions for a gentler routine. Ella took the papers in her hands, her mind racing, her chest tight. She couldn't stop thinking about how the world would look without Max by her side. How could she face life without him? On the way home, she kept glancing over at him. His head was resting against the side of the car, his eyes half closed, his breathing steady but slow. He seemed so small in that moment, fragile and yet so full of trust in her. Ella reached over and gently stroked his fur, her heart breaking with each touch. "I'll do everything I can." "Max," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the car. "You're not alone." "Not ever." As she arrived home, Ella decided to start a new routine for him, one that would make his final years as comfortable and filled with love as possible. But as she looked at Max's eyes still full of that quiet, steadfast loyalty, she couldn't help but feel the weight of what was coming. It was inevitable, it was cruel, but it was also a reality she would face, because no matter what, she would love him until the very end. And Max, in his quiet, unspoken way, would always be there with her, through the seasons of change that would come. The days blurred together, an endless cascade of mundane routines and small, quiet victories. Max's condition didn't improve, but it didn't worsen dramatically either. His joints had stiffened and his energy levels were low, but he still followed Ella around the apartment with his gentle, loping steps. The walks they used to take for miles were now reduced to slow, careful excursions around the block. And yet, despite the decline, there was something beautiful in those moments, something deeply intimate and precious that had always been there, but now felt more urgent, more fragile. Ella had noticed the little things. How Max's tail no longer wagged with the same vigor when she came home from work, how his eyes no longer sparkled with the playful gleam they once had. She could feel him aging in ways that were hard to articulate, subtle yet undeniable shifts in the fabric of their bond. But there were also flashes of his old self when he'd curl up beside her in the evenings, resting his head in her lap as if everything was still normal, and when they'd sit on the porch, watching the sunset together in silence. But it was different now. Ella had to be more mindful of his needs, more present in ways that felt almost like a role reversal. She had become the caretaker, and he had become the one who needed her care. At times it felt like she was losing him piece by piece, and the thought of what would happen when Max was no longer there kept her up at night. Her friends had noticed it, too, the quiet sadness that hung around her like a shadow. They would ask about him with hesitant concern, unsure of what to say. "How's Max?" they'd inquire, but Ella could see the worry in their eyes. They weren't just asking about the dog. They were asking about her. "He's good," she'd always answer, trying to sound casual. "He's just getting old, it's natural." But Ella knew the truth. There were only so many times she could brush off the reality of his decline. The truth was that Max was getting older, and there was nothing she could do to stop time. One evening, after a long week at work, Ella came home to find Max curled up on his bed in the living room. She could tell he hadn't moved much all day. There was something about the way he was lying there, too still, that sent a wave of anxiety through her. She knelt beside him, stroking his fur as he slowly lifted his head to look at her. "Hey, buddy," she whispered softly, trying to sound cheerful. But even her voice felt off, strained with the weight of what she was already anticipating. Max's tail gave a half-hearted wag, but it was clear that something was wrong. His breath came in short, labored bursts, and there was a dullness, too. His eyes that made Ella's heart ache. She had been here before, in this limbo where she tried to convince herself it was just another phase, another rough patch in an aging dog's life. But deep down, she knew that this time was different. This time, Max wasn't just tired, he was exhausted. "Let's get you to the vet," Ella said, though her voice trembled. She didn't need to say it out loud. She knew Max heard her, understood. Her every word as though they were written on his heart. Just as his love was imprinted on hers, she called the vet's office, and fortunately they had an opening within the hour. As she carefully helped Max into the car, her mind raced. She was trying to prepare herself for the worst, but the truth was that she wasn't ready to face it. No one ever was. She had been living in this haze of denial for so long, pretending that she could outrun the inevitable. But now it was here. Max rested his head against her lap as they drove to the clinic, his body sagging with fatigue. Ella gently ran her fingers through his fur, trying to offer him comfort, as if that could somehow change what was coming. She didn't know how long they had left. She wasn't sure she could bear it if he was in pain, but she also wasn't sure she was ready to let him go. The vet's office was quiet, almost eerily so, as they waited in the sterile room. Max lay on the cold examination table, his breathing shallow, his body limp. Ella sat beside him, one hand resting on his head, trying to offer him whatever small comfort she could. When the vet entered, her face was soft, kind, but there was a professional distance in her eyes, as if she had seen this kind of thing many times before. She began to examine Max, running her hands over his body with practiced ease. Ella watched him carefully, her heart pounding in her chest as she silently prayed that the vet would find anything that could explain his condition and make everything better. The vet finally looked up, her expression gentle but serious. "Ella," she began, her voice low and careful, "Max's heart is weakening. He's developed heart failure, and unfortunately, it's progressing more quickly than we anticipated. The medication we've been giving him is helping, but his body is tired. Ella blinked, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't the answer she had wanted. It wasn't the answer she had hoped for, but in that moment she knew this was it. The end was coming, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Are you saying? Ella started, her voice faltering. Unable to finish the question, the vet nodded. He's not in immediate pain, but I think we're nearing the end. It could be days or weeks, but his quality of life is diminishing rapidly. If he's not already in discomfort, he will be soon. Ella felt a coldness seep into her chest, the reality of the situation settling like an anchor in her stomach. The world around her seemed to blur, and she felt distant, disconnected from everything except the sound of her heart beating. She had known, deep down, that this moment would come, but she wasn't ready. She wasn't ready for Max to leave her. Can we keep him comfortable for now? She asked, her voice cracking as she struggled to hold it together. I'm not ready to say goodbye yet. The vet gave her a sad, understanding smile. We can give him something to ease his discomfort, make him as comfortable as possible. But Ella, you need to think about the next step. It's a hard decision, but you'll know when the time comes. Ella's throat tightened, her eyes stinging. With unshed tears, I don't know if I'll ever be ready. The vet didn't say anything else. She simply nodded and left them alone in the room, giving them time to process the news. Max, despite the heaviness of the moment, seemed calm. His head rested in Ella's lap, his breathing slow but steady. She could feel his warmth against her, the steady rhythm of his breath, and for a moment it was as though the world had paused. There was no rush, no need to hurry, Ella whispered to him, her words soft and tender. I love you, Max. I'll always love you. She wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. But in the silence of that room, with Max resting beside her, she realized something important. No matter what came next, their love had never been confined to the moments when he was physically beside her. It lived in the quiet gestures, in the years they'd spent together, in the silent understanding they'd shared. That love would remain, always. And even though she wasn't ready to face life without him, she knew he would always be with her. In some way, but for now, she would take each moment, one at a time, and hold on to the time they had left. Because in the end, that was all she could do. The sun was setting on another quiet day, casting its golden rays over the small city as it began to slip into the cool embrace of evening. Ella sat on the porch, Max's head resting on her lap, his once vibrant golden coat now marked by age and the passage of time. She gently stroked his fur, her fingers tracing the familiar lines of his body as she whispered sweet nothings to him. She always talked to him like this, quiet, soothing. Words that meant nothing and everything at once. They were their own language, a bond built on years of shared silence, companionship, and unconditional love. Max's breath was shallow now, and his eyes held a distant quality that Ella hadn't seen before. There was no longer the spark of the playful dog she'd adopted years ago. But as she gazed down at him, she couldn't help but feel grateful for the time they had shared. There were so many moments, so many little things that had built this life with him. The walks in the park, the quiet evenings spent curled up on the couch, the long drives to nowhere in particular. Just the two of them. Now, though, every moment felt like it was slipping through her fingers, as fleeting as the fading light in the sky. Come on, buddy, Ella whispered, gently urging Max to his feet. Let's take one last walk. It was a phrase she'd been avoiding. The idea of a last walk seemed too final, too finalizing. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that the moment would never come, but the vet had been clear. Time was running out, and Max's body could only hold on for so long. Max struggled to rise, his legs trembling, but he managed to get to his feet, leaning heavily against Ella's side for support. She held him up with the care of someone cradling a fragile treasure. She'd always known that Max wouldn't live forever, but the realization that she was now walking him to his final journey hit her like a wave. They made their way down the quiet street, Ella's hand holding Max's leash, though he didn't need it. The leash had always been a formality for the first few years of his life, when he was full of energy, bounding ahead like a little whirlwind. But now it was just a symbol, a lifeline between them, even as Max's pace had slowed to a shuffle. The park wasn't far. It was one of those small, unassuming places that most people overlooked, a simple patch of green with a few benches, a playground where children once played but now rarely ventured. It was here that Ella had spent countless afternoons with Max in the early days, watching him chase after sticks, run through the grass, and bark at squirrels. This was the place where she had first realized that their bond was something deeper than a mere companionship. Max had become a part of her, a constant, unshakable presence in her life. They reached the park, and Ella stopped near a bench, guiding Max to the spot where they had sat so many times before. He lowered himself slowly, the years showing in the way he moved. But once he was settled, his body finally still, he let out a deep sigh, resting his head on his paws. Ella sat down beside him, her hand gently resting on his back, her fingers moving absent-mindedly through his fur. She didn't know how long they sat there, but it felt like an eternity, as though the world had come to a stop for just this moment. There were no cars rushing by, no people chattering in the distance, just the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze and the rhythmic sound of Max's breathing. "I don't know how to say goodbye," she whispered, her voice trembling. The words came out as a soft sob, the dam she'd been holding back for months finally breaking open. "I don't want to let you go, Max." The tears started slowly, as if the weight of all the years they had spent together was finally catching up to her. She had never been good at saying goodbye, not to people, not to things, and certainly not to the one being who had loved her without reservation, who had been with her through all the highs and lows, without question. Max had been her anchor in a world that often felt unmored. Max turned his head toward her, his eyes soft and understanding, and for a moment Ella could almost believe that he understood her pain. She wasn't sure if dogs could truly comprehend the weight of human emotions, but she had always felt that Max was different. He seemed to know when she was sad, when she was happy, when she needed him to simply be there. There had been so many times when he had laid by her side, his presence a silent comfort, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, she was never truly alone. "I'm going to miss you so much," she whispered, her tears falling freely now. "But I'll remember you, every day. I'll never forget you." Max's tail, though slower than it once was, gave a faint wag. Ella could feel the last of his strength in that small gesture, as if he were telling her that it was okay, that he was ready, that he had lived a full life, and that he loved her just as much as she loved him. The silence between them stretched on, both of them holding on to this last moment, to the love that had been built over a lifetime. Ella knew what she had to do. She had to let him go. It wasn't an easy decision. In fact, it was the hardest one she had ever made, but she knew it was the right one. Max had suffered enough. He had given her everything he had, and now it was time for her to give him the peace he deserved. "I love you," Ella whispered one last time, pressing her forehead gently to Max's. "And I always will." The pain in her chest was unbearable, but she held him close for a moment longer, cherishing every second. She could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart against hers, the warmth of his body in her arms. And for a brief moment, time seemed to stop, just as it had when they first met. This was where it had all begun, and this was where it would end. She called the vet to make the arrangements. It wasn't easy. There was no part of her that wanted to do this, but she knew it was the final act of love she could give Max. The final gift. When they returned home later that evening, Ella carried Max in her arms, his body resting against her like a child's. She made his favorite spot on the couch, surrounded him with his favorite blanket, and sat with him, never once leaving his side. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, but she held him, just as she had always done, and whispered her love into his fur. Over and over again, the world outside seemed unaware of the grief that was unfolding inside that small apartment. It was a peaceful night, the kind where the stars were bright and the air smelled of rain. And for one last time, Max was beside her, breathing softly as he rested his head on her lap. In the quiet of that moment, Ella closed her eyes and held on to the memory of all the days they had spent together. The first day they met, the first time he licked her face in pure joy, the way he'd always been there when she needed him most. Max was her heart, her constant companion, and now, as she held him for the last time, she knew that no matter what happened, he would always be with her. And in the stillness of the night, she whispered the words she had been holding back for. So long, goodbye, my sweet Max, I'll see you again someday. Ladies and gentlemen, as we come to the end of today's incredible auction, I want to take a moment to thank you all for your participation, your enthusiasm, and your generous bids. You've shown what it means to be part of something truly special. Now, the time has come to make your final move. The lot is open, the bids are in, and this is your last opportunity to secure these one-of-a-kind treasures. Whether you're a seasoned collector, a first-time bidder, or someone who's simply here for the thrill of the chase, remember today's auction is about more than just a transaction. It's about the stories behind these items, the moments they represent, and the legacy they'll carry forward. So, I ask you one last time, who will take home this magnificent piece? Will it be you? We're in the final seconds now. Raise your paddle, place your bid, and let's make this moment count. We are about to close the doors. Don't let the chance slip away. I see you. And now, going once, going twice, and sold. Congratulations to the winning bidder. And for all of you who participated today, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Stay tuned for more, and we look forward to seeing you at the next auction. Have a wonderful evening.